Hello everyone. Today I wanted to talk about a story that happened to me when I was under the age of 13. I'm not sure exactly how old I was. I was between probably 10, 11, 12 in that age range. It happened in the 80s. And back in those days, no one locked their doors. It's hard to believe now in 2026, but it's true. No one locked their doors. We had a back door, a front door, and we also had a garage door where I lived growing up at this time. And none of those doors were locked. In fact, the garage door didn't have one of those clicker things. You had to manually open it. It was on a track. No one was home that day I got home from school. But what I can tell you is that it was a Wednesday. And you may say, well, how in the world do you remember it was a Wednesday if it happened in the 80s? Because I had Doritos. Back in those times, treats were very sparse. They were not given regularly. They were not given in between meals. They were not given in intervals. We didn't have Cheerios in a cup. We didn't have snack packs. There were no snacks. We had breakfast, lunch, dinner. And if we were really, really hungry, my grandmother always kept a stale package of cookies in a cookie jar, or she would have me go out in the apple tree and pick an apple if the apples were in season. There were no snacks like we know of snacks today. Once a week, my grandmother would allow me to have Doritos, and that's why I remember it was a Wednesday, because that was the day of the week that I was allowed to have Doritos. It was usually her shopping day, and sometimes she would bring me with her, and sometimes she wouldn't. That particular day I got home, the Doritos were already there on the counter, and a note was left for me letting me know nobody was home and to just stay in the house, because she didn't want me wandering off to go play with my friends when nobody was home, and then nobody would know where I was, because don't forget, back in those days we didn't have cell phones. I went into the living room with my snack, and also back in those days we didn't sit on the sofas as kids. Yeah, we had sofas, but me and my cousins, all of us, we just used to pile up on the floor. When I went to my cousin's house, they had those giant bean bags, so we all piled on those. But generally speaking, yeah, we would just sit on the floor and watch television. So I had my snack, I had my TV, and I had the kind with the rabbit ears where I had to put tin foil on the rabbit ears to make sure that the stations would come in, and I turned on the Brady Bunch. That was my pretty much go-to show after school some days. As I was sitting there watching television and snacking on my Doritos, I heard a noise. I could not identify this noise. I didn't even know where the noise came from, but I knew I heard a noise, and it kind of spooked me a little bit. I had a lot of cousins though, and at that time, when my cousins would come over, they wouldn't even knock on the door. They would just let themselves in, because like I said, we didn't lock our doors. The only time anybody ever knocked was if it was an encyclopedia salesperson or a vacuum salesperson. Our friends never knocked. Our family never knocked. So we didn't really get many visitors outside of that realm of family and friends. And I heard a noise, didn't know what it was. I got up to look and I didn't see anything. Of course, I just got from the living room to the kitchen. I didn't go down the hall. I didn't check the bathroom. I didn't check the bedrooms. I just went into the kitchen. When I didn't see anything, I took a knife out of the drawer where my grandmother kept all the kitchen knives, and I brought it into the living room and put it down next to me. I had this knife and I'm sitting on the floor and I'm watching my show and I'm eating my Doritos, and I hear another noise. In fact, I thought I heard somebody knocking, but on the back door. In the living room there was a door, and that my grandmother called that the front door. It was actually kind of like a side door, and off of that door was a little tiny cement patio. But we never used that door. That door was always shut, and it had an outdoor screen door and then an inner door. So that was always shut. They rarely opened that door. When I heard the noise, I realized it was coming from what we call the back door, which was the kitchen had an inner door. And then as you go out of the kitchen, there was a four-season porch. And then that was the door that I heard that was on the four-season porch. The kitchen door was an old farmhouse door. It was wooden with a glass insert at the top. And my grandmother, okay, she was from the Appalachian Mountains. And I probably said that wrong, but I didn't know that until I was older. So I didn't know my grandmother was from the Appalachian Mountains. And she had strict rules in the house, like don't leave your curtains open ever. Like our living room curtains were always closed. I never saw daylight out of that room until she passed away and we took the curtains down. Those curtains remained closed on those windows. So it was certain things like that that she did in my childhood. And the kitchen door was no exception. There was a small curtain rod that my grandfather nailed into the wood of the door, and it had a curtain that went across that little door window because she did not want anybody looking in her house. And if you're from Appalachia or you know the rituals or routines of people from there, it would make sense. Like I said, I didn't know my grandmother was from Appalachia, so I just learned a little bit about this. In any event, that curtain was closed, so I had to carefully lift it up and peek in it. And when I did that, of course, I'm looking out into the four-season porch, and I didn't see anyone. So I almost turned around and went back to the living room. And mind you, I'm a little kid at this time. I had no one guiding me as to what to do or if I should be afraid or not. I didn't know. And then the curiosity just got the best of me, I guess, because I opened the door, not realizing I probably shouldn't have, but I opened the door. And when I opened the door and looked out, I could see people walking outside by that back door off of the four-season porch. So I was like, oh, we have visitors. And I knew my grandmother wasn't home yet. I knew she would not be happy with me if I answered the door, but we didn't have stranger danger until around, I want to say the mid-80s. Growing up, I didn't know what stranger danger was. So I willingly went out into that four-season room, looked out the back door, and saw a police officer because he had a uniform on. So I knew he was a police officer, and he was walking a German Shepherd. And he came up to the door because he could see me like looking out the door of the four-season room. He saw me and he came up to the door and he knocked, and I opened the door and I said, hi. And he said, where are your parents? Well, at that time, parents weren't around. We were all left alone. That was nothing new. So I said, I don't really know. I got a note that said they're not home. And I've been sitting in the living room. And he said, okay, we have a situation. And then right then when he said that, a helicopter flew over the house and I could hear the blades whirring and everything. And I was like, what is that? And he's like, there's a helicopter. We are searching for somebody who escaped a prison. To put it in perspective, I don't live near a prison. The prisons at the time, there were a few, but they were like an hour to an hour and a half drive away from my house. There was no prison nearby. So I said to the officer, somebody escaped from prison to here? And he said he believed so. They were on foot and they could have gotten a ride, like hitchhiked a ride on the highway. Because of course, hitchhiking was a thing back then too. And he said, we are telling all the neighbors to just stay in your homes and lock your doors. And locking doors wasn't a thing we did. So I had to be mindful at that young age, of course, with his guidance to tell me, go to every door in the house and lock it. And I didn't know how to lock the garage door, but I figured, well, that's down there. But there was a door, an inner door between the garage and the four-season room. So I locked that. That had like a little hook lock. So I locked that. So I felt safe. And then I went back in my kitchen, locked the kitchen door, and then I went back in the living room. And I sat down and I grabbed my bag of Doritos and I started watching my TV show again. Because mind you, we didn't have like remotes with pause buttons or anything. We just had to get up and change the station anytime we wanted to change the channel. That may be why we sat on the floor in front of the TV, because we didn't have remotes that we could sit on the couch with, and easily access channels and things. So as I was sitting there eating my Doritos, I realized the knife was missing. And in fear, I turned around and I looked over at the door in the living room and it was wide open. The screen was shut, but the inner door that was always shut was wide open. And the fear that set in me, I can't even describe that feeling. I still feel it today when I'm thinking about this story. A few minutes later, my grandmother did arrive home, and now I have to make my way through the kitchen and through the four-season room to unlock that inner door between the garage and the four-season room. And I was saying to myself, oh boy, I don't know if I can do this. But I looked outside and I didn't see anyone creeping around. The police were gone. The helicopter was still in the air, but further away. And I was like, what do I do? So at that moment, because I was so terrified, I went to the kitchen. I'm guessing here now that I most likely looked out the little glass window again through the curtain. And when I thought the coast was clear, I probably walked out because I had to let my grandmother in because of that little hook lock that was on that inner door. And I just remember feeling so afraid. And then I felt mad. Like, how dare this person violate us like that? And when my grandmother came in, she was like, what is going on? And I explained to her what happened. And she relayed a story to me that years prior, I was there, but I was smaller, so I didn't remember this. And she said that we all came home. I don't know if it was from a banquet or going out to eat or something like that. We all came home and the house was torn apart, ransacked, drawers were taken out, flipped over, the couches were flipped over, people were looking for stuff. My grandparents didn't own anything valuable. They never bought any name brands. They were very frugal farm owners. They had a small family farm, and that's all they had. My grandmother didn't even have a pair of dress shoes. She still had clothes that she wore in the 50s. She never bought herself anything. And my grandfather, he was the same way. He had nice suits because he did manage a whole company. So he had some nice suits, but nothing anybody would want. They probably came from Sears. And sadly, she told me the story that my grandfather's pocket watch was gone during that burglary. That was the only thing that was missing. And the pocket watch probably wasn't even real gold or silver. It was probably a costume jewelry thing. And it belonged to my grandfather's father. And on the front, it had a picture of a train because my great-grandfather worked on the railroad. And my grandfather kind of never got over that, the shock of losing that to a burglar. They never found out who did it. And unfortunately, you would think something like that would have rattled them so that they would lock their doors after that, but they didn't. And now, here I was, faced with the possibility that an escaped prisoner actually came into my house when I was there alone. I think that experience really added something to who I am. It didn't make me paranoid. It didn't make me terrified. It didn't make me afraid. Now, of course, in the moment, I probably felt all of those things. It made me cautious as a person. I don't go around looking over my shoulder or anything, but it did make me cautious. You know, it's one of those things where you think twice or you check the locks again. Like, whenever I leave my house now, I make sure that door is good and locked. I always make sure my car door is good and locked. And I'm always double checking everything. And I think that's where that came from because of the experience I had as a kid. Let me know in the comments below if you ever experienced something like that before you turned 13 and how it shaped your life. Thank you so much for watching today. Take care.